My name is Dr. Stephanie MacKenzie. I'm a professor in the English program, Grenfell Campus, Memorial University, Newfoundland, Canada. But I'm here in Buenos Aires right now, Argentina, leaving for Canada tomorrow. One of my specialties over the last couple of decades has been Caribbean literature. And I'm here to interview Arturo Desimone, who is going to talk to me today in part about the Caribbean and the foundations the Caribbean has provided for him.
Thank you for proposing this interview and bringing me over here. Thank you.
Not a problem, not a problem. We're in Buenos Aires, Argentina right now. Arturo, I know information can be found about you online and in various forums, but I'm wondering if you can say a couple of words about where you came from, what has made you, and why we're in Buenos Aires today.
Yes, what has made me, well, I was born on the island Aruba in the Dutch Caribbean, though the Caribbean, a few miles from the coast of Venezuela. And I am also a citizen of Argentina since I was 1 year old.
Okay.
That was my first nationality because my father came from here in the late 1970s. He was a musician. He went to Aruba, and my mother's family, though originally from Poland and east of Poland, they came to the Caribbean coast of Colombia, and from there, from Poland to the Caribbean coast of Colombia, and from there to Aruba, somewhere in the middle of the 20th century. So
Okay.
I was born on Aruba, and family history has also brought me to spend some years here in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. So.
Okay. Where would you consider home to be, or are you a citizen of the world, so to speak?
Citizen of the world is a term I tend to find a little bit suspect. I reserve some suspicions towards the term world citizen, though many people also in the Caribbean will say very cosmopolitan, and I cannot reject the term, and certainly they intend it as something positive. Not always. Yes, I find I'm, well, rather itinerant in a way.
Okay.
I don't find it particularly glamorous. It has come very naturally to me because I always had many connections that were sprawled across very vast parts of the world because of ancestry, because of family that ended up fleeing different crises here and there, different calamities. They spread all over the world, and on the other hand, Aruba is a very small island. I won't get the measurements exactly right, maybe 14 by 20 something kilometers. And,
Wow.
Yes, and it's very restricted. So the first more or less 20 years of my life were on this island, though I did go on holiday now and then. So.
Okay. Well, if you're abandoning the term citizen of the world, let me come from this direction. I've spent a number of years now specializing in Caribbean literature, and I see that you've published in such places or such magazines as BIM, for
Yes.
instance, and Small Axe. Would you consider yourself a Caribbean writer?
At the end of the day, yes. Indeed, at first it seemed unlikely that I would regard myself in that manner. I read widely outside of the Caribbean, and try to find some kind of origins or some kind of genetics in the literature from countries where ancestors came from. People around me always found it rather eccentric that I existed and was born on Aruba. What are you doing here? How can it be? Because I'm not really representative of what is Arubian, not my name, not anything. So I read a lot of Argentinian, East European literature, especially the poetry, Middle Eastern, Jewish poetry, Hebrew, Italian, mostly Latin American, and I just read very widely, not only specifically anything related to me directly, but at the end of the day, if I read Marquez, who is from the Caribbean, more or less situated near the Caribbean coast, or at least he planted his world there, the world he writes about. I'm not sure how close Aracataca is to the Caribbean where he's from, but or if I read V.S. Naipaul, who I don't really see eye to eye with someone like Naipaul in terms of anything with regard to politics or ethics. But if I read his fiction, if I read his prose, if I read Walcott's, if I read or the Dutch Caribbean writers like the novelist Tip Maruch, which was a pseudonym used by who I believe was the greatest novelist of Curaçao. If I read Jean Rhys, of course, Wyatt Sargasso Sea, I noticed that I recognize everything is very familiar, despite that I would not think of myself in any way ubiquitous to the Caribbean. Nonetheless, I tend to be proven wrong when I read the actual literature that came from there, because I recognize everything. And it's a combination of I don't want to name a list of ingredients, the plants, the trees, the climate, and so forth, but I recognize situations, things that I think may have happened around the corner from me in this literature. And sometimes I also recognize it in the literature that came from places where my grandfather came from in Poland, like if I read Isaac Bashevis Singer, but mostly I do recognize it more instantaneously if I read from the texts from whether prose or poetry from the Caribbean, if it was written in an inspired manner.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, my next question has to do with, I'm encroaching upon a discussion of the dissemination of your work. As an itinerant poet, not a world citizen.
Or maybe itinerant is a lousy word choice. I
love it. I love it. Nothing wrong with that. So this book is published by Hesterglock Press Imprint, and I hadn't heard of the publishing house before, which is probably my ignorance. I know you've traveled a lot, and I'm wondering where your reception is greatest. You've written from Africa, you've written from Europe, from South America. Where is, I don't like this term, but where is your greatest following, so to speak? Is there a nation or a school of poets who is most familiar with your work? I'm really not all that certain, because the vast majority of publications I've had are in online literary magazines, and the internet remains a matter of voyeurism. So you can never be all that sure what is going on with one's material. It's hard to control that or to measure that. I think of this. I saw this documentary of this funny man, his name Sixto Rodriguez, the singer, a rock singer from the United States, from Detroit, who had no idea that he was very well known in South Africa. He had not the faintest idea. He thought, he was living practically on the street, and he had not. They tried to kill his records. They tried to kill his album. And he had not the faintest idea that people in South Africa were massively. Not that I don't have any delusion that that's happening with my work. That would be like some kind of silly daydream. But I do find that
with the internet. The thing is, I've written many articles on politics, and people tend to contact me sometimes about articles on politics published in usually left-wing websites. Some of them don't have the greatest reputation, but they are very widely read, and often they're read in just around the world, in South Africa, in the Anglosphere. Whenever an article got translated into Spanish, it was widely circulated in not only about politics, but also about, like I wrote about the history of poets who were disappeared by the regime here. Interrupt me if I'm talking too much, please.
I'm here to interview you, that's fine.
Yes, but these got circulated a lot in Argentina and in Latin America, and I frankly, I don't know. There was a literary organization called MOCO, which is has its base in the island Tortola, the British Virgin Island, and they brought me over to do a workshop with some poets, and but I've also performed mostly translations into Spanish of my poetry at festivals in Nicaragua. The last festival to be held, the last poetry festival of Granada, Nicaragua, in the recent years before the political situation there erupted. I performed there for the first time in front of an audience of thousands of people, and I very much liked the response from the audience, as well as the audience from Nicaragua, as well as the international poets. But that was only possible because of translation.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. I'm very interested in dissemination and publishing and how one gets one's voice out there, right? And I've read through your blog, not everything because there's so much material on it.
Yes.
I'm wondering, what are the publishing opportunities for writers here in Argentina or in South America? I know something about what it's like in the Caribbean, and
Yes.
probably the most noteworthy press is People Tree Press, operating out of Leeds, but it's very difficult to find a publisher in the Caribbean. What is the situation like here?
In Argentina, well, it depends. I am really an Argentine, but a foreigner as well, writing usually in English in a country where very few people actually speak or read English. Many prefer not to. They might read Bartleby in Spanish translation saying, I prefer not to. And well, for somebody who writes in Spanish or who has translations available, it's not really all that difficult to get published. I find that Argentina has less of a massive audience for poetry than any other Latin American nation. I think Chile, Colombia, Peru, Nicaragua all have, and Mexico, they all have a more broad and young audience that wants to hear poetry, that has the culture of seeing the poet as a conjurer of sorts. Not so much Argentina. Argentina is a culture of speed.
Of speed?
Of speed,
Okay.
of comedy, of rock and roll. It's not a very introverted culture. I think that, especially not the capital, certainly the provinces to the north are more prone to produce poetry, to produce the culture that understands and connects with poetry, where an average person, rather than an erudite, rather than some high priest, an average person has a very intuitive connection with poetry. That's harder to find in Argentina than in the surrounding countries. I do see the potential for that culture in the island where I was from, Aruba and Curacao. Only conservatism is much more prominent in Aruba and Curacao than I imagine it to be on other Caribbean islands. I find that one is less free. I mean, if you don't mind, I would still talk about the Caribbean because,
please.
Because I mean, the Anglophone Caribbean is another matter. I think that one is more free and there are more opportunities when it comes to performing and publishing. On Barbados, for example, the relationship between the Commonwealth and the London publishing world is much more. It's much more compared to Aruba and Curacao. It's more natural. Thing is, on Aruba and Curacao, the majority speak and read and think in Papiamento, Creole, which is slightly similar to what people speak in the Cape Verdean islands. I wrote about this in an essay in Small Acts, a manifesto of sorts on translation. And yet, Aruba and Curacao, they are still somehow in some kind of eerie construction that is perhaps beneficial or wise for the time being. They are still within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. What that means, however, is that educational and publishing opportunities remain in Amsterdam in a language that is not the language that is most often the language people write in or read in or speak. And the markets of the Netherlands, I find it's much more limited than the markets, the literary market. To use such a strange term, I mean, maybe writers should not use these terms. Maybe agents should talk that way, the literary market.
Okay, let's talk about language. You just drew attention to, can I call it the Creole of Aruba?
It is a Creole language,
okay.
yes.
So you still speak the Creole?
Sure, I do.
Okay.
It's not the language I most often write in, very rarely. I would like to explore this more in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. How many languages do you speak?
Around 5. I speak around 5 fluently, and yes.
What are they? That's amazing.
I speak English, Spanish, Dutch, Papiamento, French.
Is there a language which you associate most with with your poetic voice? Is it English?
No, it depends. It depends. I don't want to fall into a trend I see a lot of writers of my generation who feel like they are trapped and that they were robbed, they have no choice but to write in English because of history, their Hindi or their Farsi or their Spanish is not that good and their parents had to move. And I don't want to fall into that trap. I spoke English with my mother. I spoke Spanish with my father because my mother's father was from Poland, but her mother had a more American upbringing in New York. So that's how the language traveled to my larynx, to my mouth, and as simple as that. And it's very hard to sever from, it's harder to sever from the maternal tongue than to sever from one's mother. So I wrote in, and I did not choose, it was perhaps conscious then not to write in Papiamento. Not really my preference not to write in Spanish, though. I am, anyway, I'm talking a lot, I forgot the question.
You're the reason I'm here.
Yes.
Let's shift a little bit, and I'm going to talk about your drawings at some point too. But let's shift to the act of translation. I see on your blog that you've published there some of your translations of Spanish poets or people who are writing in Spanish, South American.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could talk about or address translation and why it's important to you, and whether you see that as an essential part of your artistic practice and maybe your soul. And also just in terms of that too, who do you think are the most important, some of them, the most important contemporary South American poets today?
Well, I have to, it requires just me to pause for a moment to think about
Absolutely.
carefully who I think is the most important contemporary. Is translation immensely important for my soul? The act of translation itself, not so much. Perhaps I am indebted somehow because though I wrote in English, I was very much dependent on translations from other languages into English. I read translations of Russian poetry, of Mandelstam, his wife's memoirs, Nadezhda Mandelstam. Somehow that was available on our bookshelf on Aruba, Isaac Babel. I studied Hebrew and Arabic poetry and translation before I became serious about studying these actual languages, Hebrew and Arabic, which I do study. I've depended heavily on translation, and mostly translation into English, mostly following my literary interests. I read more of that and less of Raymond Carver, or less of Mark Strand, and more of Firdausi or Mahmoud Darwish, Palestinian poet. So translation in the passive sense was important. Now I do have I have too many plans and programs and to have an orderly existence, really. But one thing I do consider important is to translate the poets who were forcibly disappeared in this country, because the greatest talents of their generation were forcibly disappeared, and it led to an emptiness in literature that has been glorified by the machinery of hype, but never been filled. Miguel Ángel Bustos, great surrealist poet, who was not, only recently was he translated. I interviewed his translator. When it comes to when it comes to the Creole of Aruba, I feel I have to combine the two geographical areas because your emphasis is Caribbean. When it comes to Aruba, I do find that translation will be very important for the survival of that language in the future, but more important is the translation of other languages into Papiamento. Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to that question about, or maybe I can ask the general question that so many people ask writers in interviews. Who are your main influences? And maybe in the past, maybe today, and maybe that'll bring up a consideration of contemporary writers.
My main influences. When it comes to poetry, most of them have been, again, translations from Eastern Europe and the Middle East. I grew up with, as a pubescent, adolescent, whatever, with a lot of books I was reading, and it's been so varied and so much. I am also very much under the spell always of poetry in Spanish from a certain period, from St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila to Federico Garcia Lorca, who I find is a poet that I have very, very deeply internalized always. It is a very close relationship I've always had with especially the poem of Poema del Cantejondo, and this has always and also reading novels like Yevgeny Zamyatin's We was a big hit, and also The Beat Generation. But that was, I mean, that's good for teenagers, when you're a teenager, to read Naked Lunch and so on. Beat Generation, Nabokov, when I was a teenager. I mean, now I've read very broadly, so I no longer know. When I was a teenager, I liked Sylvia Plath, for example. I don't believe now, today, that she is still because it is so, the influences are layers, and at some point it's hard to tell anymore. Everything has been smashed and mixed up and fused together like glass in the furnace, and you can't tell the original grains of sand.
Let's talk about education and about reading. I think we've had this conversation. You're self-taught. Have you ever? Are you? Have you ever? Have you ever studied writing formally? What about university education?
Yes. Well, when I was 15 or so, I took my mother's bank credit card, and I signed up for online writers' workshops with Gotham.
Did she know you took her credit card?
She accepted it, because there are worse things you can do. So I signed up to these workshops that were online writers' workshops, and that was good for me to start off. That was the only workshop type of setting I did.
At 15, yeah.
So more or less, yeah. And I mostly read outside of the context of school. I think it was, it was a necessary matter to be an autodidact of sorts, because the educational system of Aruba, despite that the teachers were mostly local, the system was still very colonial, and very bad, and the children had a hard time with very old material from the 1950s, written by some Dutch friars. We were children in the 1990s, of course, and it was rather limiting. So I read outside of my education, and for different reasons altogether, I left school at the age of 15, and I dropped out. I decided it would be wise to get a GED, so I went to a place in the refinery town of San Nicolas, where the University of Aruba gives the general equivalency diploma exams. So I did that, I passed, and then I dropped out of school. And, that was a decision I took.
I consider that very precocious. I love that.
Yeah, my parents weren't too excited.
I'm sure they're not, especially if their credit cards kept going missing. Let's talk about the combination of your artistic practice. Your drawings are strewn throughout your book.
Yeah, in a small format, yes.
Yes, you have copious amounts of drawings.
This was also, the editor was very eager to include more and more drawings.
Okay. But let's talk about the drawings themselves, and when you began drawing, and how you would consider those in relation to your writing. And you also write essays too.
Yes.
Is there a primary form of artistic expression that is your first and greatest love, or do the illustrations and the essays all go together?
Essays emerge in a different manner. Essays sometimes emerge really from frustration from the very narrow parameters of the ruling rhetoric of the moment I hear around me. It frustrates me, and then I want to have some kind of, maybe it's vindictive, but also I want to free up my own thinking and perhaps the thinking of those around me. Maybe the venom of social media has brought me to rebel by writing essays or to save my own thought processes. I don't know. But the way of making a drawing, the way a drawing begins to happen, and the way a poem happens are very similar. These are similar ways of testing and touching a reality that is becoming visible and tangible the more you meddle with it.
Do you prefer one form over the other, or?
There's a lot of pleasure in drawing. There's a lot of pleasure in drawing, but it is very different from poetry. Poetry is a way of making an edifice to carry very extreme emotions in a way that is meaningful and to others. And drawing is a way of seeing, it's a way of seeing,
Okay.
If that makes sense. Prose, very little of my prose has been published, so I don't feel so free to talk about that. But prose is also different. I mean, prose that's not essayistic.
Let's talk about travel. I mean, I happened to meet you by happenstance at Residencia Corazon in La Plata, which is great, which led to this opportunity. And for me, travel is one of the most important things in my life. It's how I learn significantly. How important is travel to you? I see that you've traveled a lot. Is it essential to the manner in which you understand the world or express yourself to the world?
Travel is essential in understanding the world. It is impossible to seriously fathom the current events happening out there only by reading explanations in journals. It is very important to, as Mark Twain said, travel is fatal to prejudice, or Miguel de Unamuno sounded more activistic when he said el fascismo se cura leyendo y el racismo se cura viajando. Fascism you cure by reading, racism by traveling. But that's a more specific political point he was making. I don't travel to cure my racism. That would be quite a lot of antibiotics I needed. But if that was the main reason. But I find it very futile to talk about current events without having been to countries and interacted with people in those countries. But it always came rather naturally to me because I had a very restricted life on Aruba, a small island. Then due to mostly misfortune, I left Aruba for the Netherlands. It was never my destination. I mean, especially because so many Arubians go to the Netherlands, and I don't know how much it helps them. And they seem to become a little bit gloomy about it. And but I went to the Netherlands because I needed a stable, predictable place for a certain time, and because of a certain health matters that couldn't be attended to on Aruba. It wasn't a happy choice. But once I was in the Netherlands, which I found never to be a very stimulating place, I begun to travel in a way that somewhat in the way I wanted to, though I did not really have means. Really, I did it in the most austere way possible, which I guess a lot of young people do. I mean, a lot of people a little bit younger than me still. And I mean, I went to Spain to see where Lorca was from, to Granada. Then I went to Poland to see where my grandfather's family had fled from, my maternal grandfather. And and I understood many things about my own history, about Poland. I went to the Middle East because I had relatives there. That was the first time I went there, very briefly. Not an especially happy trip. I went to. I started to travel in a more sweet, sugary, and luxurious manner when the invitations to poetry festivals came in, because unlike the online literary journals in English, nobody reads those, but the online literary journals in Spanish, people are really looking at them, they're really following them. And
is that right? That's wonderful.
Yeah, so after I started to publish translations, the invitations came in to go to Cuba, to go to Nicaragua, or to be in a poetry festival here in Argentina, where I happen to have a complex family history and a story here that I find very important for my writing. Also, I mean, Aruba, you feel free to interrupt me.
I'm going to soon, but go ahead.
Well, Aruba being a colony, or being a former colony, strange limbo, is a place where a certain amnesia or a certain tabula rasa about origins weighs upon the people, and it was, it wasn't just imposed, but people participated in that, and that made it very important to not accept tabula rasa, to not accept a blissful oblivion, forgetting one's origins. It made it important for me to look into origins, to go to the places where ancestors came from.